So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give this just a second. We have many participants who are joining our call today. It is going to take a minute or two for them all to come online, but as people are coming online, I do want to welcome you to this, which is the last formal speaking event that we have associated with the School of Policy Studies for this academic year. It's lovely to see so many people taking part and coming out. While people are coming online, I want to take a moment just to welcome you. My name is Warren Mabey, and I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. I want to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. Where we are here at Queen's University is in what used to be called Cataraqui and is still reflected in the names of the rivers and the creeks that are around us. This was really a meeting place. This is where many different nations came together and met and traded and talked. And you know, I like to think that Queen's University sort of carries that tradition on. We are a place where people can come together to meet, to learn from each other, to study with each other, and really to build up that knowledge and build up that understanding that we all need. So I want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that you're all joining us from many different parts of Canada or parts of the world. That means that you're coming from many different traditional or unceded territories. And I hope that as you are hearing me speak, you're thinking a little bit about where you're situated and the peoples that have come before. This particular talk is a talk in the Tom Courchene Distinguished Speakers Series, which was founded and funded by Margie and Tom Courchene. Tom, as many of you will know, was the first director of the School of Policy Studies. And this speaker series really continues the tradition that Tom established as the inaugural director of our school to serve as a bridge between the academic and professional policy communities. It engages faculty, students, policymakers, politicians, and opinion leaders to discuss major policy issues. And a particular focus of this speaker series is Indigenous policy and governance, which is a topic that Tom has been passionate about and has written about for many years. I want to take a moment just to thank Tom and Margie for their continued support for this series. It allows us to have wonderful talks and really interesting and important talks. So we couldn't do that without your support. Our speaker today is the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould. And Ms. Wilson-Raybould is a member of the Wewake Nation in BC. She's been a councillor to her nation. She served 2 terms as the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations before she was first elected as a member of parliament for Vancouver-Granville back in 2015. She was re-elected in 2019 as an independent and is the only independent elected member of parliament in the current House. She was the first Indigenous Canadian to serve as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. She's also served as Minister of Veterans Affairs. And in today's talk, she is addressing what I firmly believe is one of the most critical issues that faces Canadians, which is addressing and implementing Indigenous rights. And specifically, she's going to be talking a bit about the role that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples could play in driving change. So while we can't give a thunderous round of applause, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould. The floor is yours.
Well, Ed, thank you, Warren. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I am very pleased to join everybody today virtually. From what I understand from your opening comments across the country and specifically at Queen's University, thank you for allowing me and inviting me to be and take part in the Tom Courchene Distinguished Speakers Series. I had the opportunity just before coming on to meet Margie and Tom Courchene, and that was a pleasure. So happy to be here. This is a speakers series I know that has hosted a number of tremendous speakers and experts on issues of racial justice and as was mentioned, Indigenous reconciliation. Looking at the list of speakers before me, I see a number of mentors, friends, and colleagues of mine, and I'm grateful to include my voice or impart some of my learnings and teachings to you. Certainly as a proud Indigenous person in this country, also as the independent member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville, and I'll just add on to the introduction. I am the first ever in our country's history female to be elected as an independent member of Parliament, and also adding my voice as and based on my experience as the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General and Regional Chief. So as was mentioned, I've been asked today to speak about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and what role it can and cannot play in the work of reconciliation in this country. Of course, we know, we see it in the papers and in the media. This is a topic increasingly at the center of public discourse and debate. UNDRIP has increased in terms of its prominence of discussion in recent years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report called it a framework for reconciliation. And federally and provincially governments have enacted or are in the process of enacting legislation to implement it. It is also increasingly framing the way in which we talk about these issues and the lexicon of rights discourse. It is an important topic, and it is also one around which there is a lot of rhetoric and misinformation, confusion, and fear. And I hope today to be able to share some of my thoughts that might help to contribute towards efforts at clarity. But before I begin, as Warren was mentioning, I too would like to acknowledge the territory where I am speaking from today, the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm in my riding of Vancouver Granville. I'd also like to introduce myself. My traditional name is Puglaas, and I come from the Muskama, Dawadanuk, and Likwithka people of Northern Vancouver Island, off the west coast of British Columbia, part of the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Kwakwala speaking people. And I am from the Eagle Clan. My father is Himas Klalilikla, Bill Wilson, and my grandmother was Pugladi, Ethel Pearson. So I recently read an article in The Atlantic about Indigenous matters in the United States. The author writes, quote, "We live in a time of historical reconsideration as more and more people recognize that the sins of the past still harm the present." These words are also true in Canada on matters of racial justice for Indigenous peoples and addressing our legacy of colonialism. There is a reconsideration taking place. There is a growing awareness and understanding, a new recognition. I was first elected Regional Chief of British Columbia in 2009. Since that time, what I have witnessed is that recognition among Canadians is increasing about the importance of addressing Indigenous reconciliation, how it's changed in dramatic ways. From the young to the not so young, so many Canadians are learning more, yearning to understand more, are listening, and are wanting to take action themselves and see action taken. There are now what we call allies everywhere, as distinct from the past, where it often felt they were few and far between. So this is important, and we are making change. And in this greater awareness, there is an understanding that the sins of the past still haunt the present. We see this when we look at issues like murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, access to clean drinking water, the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, the vast numbers of Indigenous children and youth in care, the tragic rates of suicide, particularly among Indigenous youth, and many other social and economic indicators. We also have been starkly reminded about the sins of the past and how they still haunt us in the present through the COVID-19 pandemic. Certain peoples and communities have been disproportionately impacted. This is true within countries and when viewed globally. We see how privilege and historic and existing disparities have contributed to different outcomes and degrees of suffering in the pandemic. The endurance of systemic racism has been highlighted. But beyond the public discourse and political acknowledgement and rhetoric, the reconsiderations are not taking fast enough within institutions with change and reform. And this brings us to the heart of the issue and my experience at the center of government, where much of the change has to be led. Why is this legacy still with us? How come it has been so hard for the necessary change to be made? What do governments need to do, and why haven't they done it? And what is the role that the UNDRIP can play in doing what needs to be done? 4 decades ago, when the constitutional discussions were taking place about the repatriation of our Constitution and the development of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a substantive political discussion in Canada's history about the rights of Indigenous peoples took place. It resulted in Section 35 of the Constitution that affirmed and protected Indigenous rights, including treaties. The inclusion of Section 35 was an important development, but the reality is that the way Section 35 was treated by governments after it was enacted turned Section 35 more into being evidence of our legacy of colonialism rather than a tool for addressing it. To understand why this is the case, consider how the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as compared to Section 35, have been used by governments. Both the Charter and Section 35 were adopted in 1982. With regards to the Charter, governments organized themselves to comply with it, including in laws, policies, and practices. Of course, the courts had and do have a role to play to identify the limits and extent, confirm meanings, and settle the hard and important issues. But no government and no politician would ever dare to say to a Canadian, you don't have the right to free speech, or go prove that you have the right to free speech. Well, Indigenous peoples and Section 35 were treated differently. Governments did not address the review of laws, policies, and practices with respect to Indigenous rights as they did with parts of the Charter. And indeed, when Indigenous peoples say they have Indigenous and historic treaty rights, the response has been and remains to this day, go prove it. And even then, after decades in court with clear Supreme Court of Canada decisions, even then we see governments fail to implement the decisions and act like rights exist. Indeed, this is what we see in the headlines today, whether it be in relation to the lobster fisheries in the East, Indigenous patients dying in emergency rooms while racist comments are made, to confusion and chaos from a failure to have proper decision-making regimes with Indigenous peoples over resource development. This practice, this hypocrisy, this affirmation of charter rights and the need to change laws and policies, but denial of Indigenous rights and not changing laws and policies is, in my opinion, the most insidious and prime example of systemic racism rooted in the legacy of colonialism that remains pervasive at the highest levels of government and underpins the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. While some progress has been made in implementing Section 35, the practice of denial has not changed. Unfortunately, shamefully, and disappointingly, we can look at the current government as an illustration of this. On February 14th, 2018, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and acknowledged he and his government knew of this longstanding hypocrisy. The Prime Minister said these words, quote, 2017 marked 35 years since Aboriginal and treaty rights were recognized and affirmed through Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The government of the day, led by my father, did not intend to include these rights at the outset. It was the outspoken advocacy of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, supported by non-Indigenous Canadians, that forced the government to reconsider. Imagine what that must have been like, to have fought so hard for so long against colonialism, rallying your communities, reaching out to Canadians, riding the Constitutional Express, and in the end, to finally be recognized and included, to see your rights enshrined and protected in the foundational document upon which Canada's democracy rests. Now imagine the mounting disappointment, the unsurprising and familiar headache, and the rising tide of anger when governments that had promised so much did so little to keep their word, end quote. In that speech, Prime Minister Trudeau pledged to adopt a new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework to finally end this hypocrisy, to entrench in law standards and create mechanisms to ensure Indigenous peoples' rights are upheld and not constantly fought about. In committing this, he was building on 10 principles, the principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, which the government released in July of 2017, to help guide the relationship, including the development of a rights recognition framework. The 10 principles, which I understand are still hung on the walls in both French and English in every CERNA and Indigenous Services Canada office across the country, explicitly affirm the strength of our Section 35 framework, that rights and title exist, that treaties are solemn promises that must be implemented, that Indigenous laws, governments, and jurisdictions have vital and essential roles to play in Canada. They are rejection of the practice of denial and delay through litigation that have been the cornerstones of government policy since 1982. But guess what? This did not happen. Indeed, within a few months after the Valentine's Day speech, those aspirations were abandoned. The government does not even talk about them anymore. Like governments past, this government just accepts that it is hypocritical, accepts the entrenched colonial and racist status quo, and carries on. Like governments past, it simply accepts the legacy of colonialism should not be uprooted. What is so upsetting with this government is that they had a path to follow, but they would not follow it. During those constitutional talks in the 1980s, one of the great Indigenous leaders of the time from British Columbia, the late Chief Joe Mathias, spoke to the type of leadership that is needed. He said to, quote, "Behold the turtle. He moves forward when he sticks his neck out," end quote. I think about these words a lot because they sum up the challenge and the problem we have, which is a problem of will, a lack of political will, a lack of courage, and an inability or care to do the right thing. What makes this lack of action even more shameful is that we know what to do. Generations of advocacy by Indigenous peoples, countless studies and analyses, RCAP, TRC, MMIWG, the UNDRIP, all reveal the solutions. They have been stated time and again. Indigenous peoples know what needs to be done. We have known and said it for generations. The government knows it also and has known for some time. So, what are those changes? there are certain foundational transformative shifts that are needed to be established as the proper basis for relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. At the core of the legacy of colonialism for First Nations has been the Indian Act, a colonial statute that is well over a century old. Today, the Indian Act remains the primary instrument that governs the lives of First Nations. The Indian Act was designed to break up the families, governments, and social and cultural systems of First Nations. It outlawed our governments, was the basis for the residential schools, cemented the Indian Reserve System, and criminalized aspects of our culture and way of life. The Indian Act also denied basic human rights of First Nations to vote, to move around, to hire a lawyer, and so on. Today, much of the Indian Act remains unchanged, and the federal government, through Indigenous Services Canada, spends billions of dollars every year managing poverty through a colonial statute, acting as the paternalistic overseer of a racist system. Alongside the Indian Act and its express denial of Indigenous peoples and their rights, there has been the reality of the omission, the denial of Indigenous peoples and their rights broadly in government laws, policies, and practices. Our federal laws are out of date. With few exceptions, Canada's laws, such as those around land and resources, presume that Indigenous land rights do not exist. Again, despite dozens of Supreme Court of Canada decisions to the contrary. This creates uncertainty about land and resource development, which is rooted, again, in the government's failure to recognize and implement rights. This is why we see so much conflict and tension on the land base and an inability to move forward. So how do we make the shift and put those new foundations in place? Well, for years, I and others expressing the solutions that we've known for years have laid out a plan for what needs to be done. I have often, including when I was Minister of Justice, described the plan with the following elements, or including the following elements. 1, entrench recognition standards. Set legislated standards that all public officials have to act based on principles of rights recognition to end the practice of denial, as I just described. This is how we ensure Indigenous rights are upheld consistently across all government does. 2, legislate UNDRIP. More on this in a moment. 3, establish mechanisms for self-government and moving out of the Indian Act. This is something that I've spoken about for years, to move out of policy-based negotiations that limit self-government arbitrarily to actually requiring governments to recognize Indigenous governments that have been rebuilt, have rebuilt their governing systems and chosen to move out from under the Indian Act. 4, establish new Indigenous institutions and capacity support for nation building. Critically, starting to end the roles of ministers created to colonize and moving supports and work to institutions that are Indigenous controlled. Again, as part of moving and ending the Indian Act. 5, establishing new oversight, accountability, and dispute resolution institutions. These are so necessary. Government needs to be accountable, reported on, assessed. Rights recognition needs to progress, and we need to know how it is progressing. As this is happening, we also all have a responsibility to move towards a far more solution-oriented approach to advancing the work. And out of the courts, systematizing a culture of dispute resolution that is effective, appropriate, faster, and cheaper. Such solutions are needed not only between non-Indigenous governments and Indigenous peoples, but also within Indigenous nations to support nation rebuilding. For example, in determining such issues as boundaries and relationship of laws. Importantly, this is also a bridge to how our Indigenous legal orders will be operating more and more every day in guiding relations with each other and with other governments. So now, where does the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples fit in to all of this? And how does it fit into the work of rebuilding Indigenous nations within Canada and ameliorating the social ills that still plague so many Indigenous communities? Well, of course, UNDRIP does have a role. The declaration was developed through a deliberative process involving Indigenous peoples and states over decades. What the UNDRIP does is express the specific context of Indigenous peoples' basic human rights norms that Canada and Canadians all cherish and have for decades, ever since the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted after World War II. The UNDRIP does not create any new human rights. The UNDRIP articulates the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. These need to be upheld and implemented. Doing that is part of entrenching recognition standards that I mentioned earlier. The UNDRIP is helpful and important because it aims to be comprehensive in speaking to the rights of Indigenous peoples. It articulates them in more detail than, for example, Section 35 of the Constitution. It provides a language and a foundation for speaking about how to respect both the individual and collective human rights of Indigenous peoples. Section 35 of the Constitution, as we know, speaks to collective rights. But there's a lot of confusion and fear about the minimum standards in the Declaration and what the Declaration means and what it does. Some people speak about the Declaration and some of its articles as meaning far more than they do. Others speak about them meaning far less. And not nearly enough of our dialogue is about how to implement the UNDRIP in principled and practical ways. Let me give you an example. Free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. This is probably the most talked about standard in the Declaration. Consent appears as a standard in numerous articles of the UNDRIP, including in relation to the use of lands and resources. I would suggest that consent has become a rhetorical device in the context of potential conflict used for political purposes. Too rarely have we actually had a discussion about how to pragmatically operationalize and implement it. I think consent requires a bit of demystification as well as some straight talk. So I have 3 observations to share. First, we need to be clear that the issue of consent is not a new one, which has arisen somehow as a result of UNDRIP. Consent has been noted as a matter to be addressed in Crown Indigenous relations by the courts for many years in the interpretation of Section 35, including in such cases as Delgamuukw, Haida, Chilcotin. Indeed, in Chilcotin, the court, in paragraph 97, recommended and encouraged shifting to obtaining consent as the standard for governments and industries in relations with Indigenous peoples, regardless of whether the court's declarations or findings had been issued. The rationale for doing this is that it would remove the likelihood of conflict, legal struggles, and uncertainty about a project or decision. More so, even though we have tended to use different language, de facto consent is something that both governments and industries have over the years sometimes realized is a necessary part of the path forward. This is one of the underlying reasons for many of the impact benefit agreements that industry has properly pursued. When this is done and done in the right way, one sees cooperation and collaboration about resource development. When it is not, we see the likelihood of conflict and contention. Second, we have tended to think about consent through the lens of the processes currently used for consultation and accommodation, and that somehow consent involves doing what we have been already doing, with additional enhancements involving whether or not consent is achieved. I would suggest that this is not a very helpful way of thinking about consent. Consent is not simply an extension of existing processes of consultation and accommodation, nor is the law of consultation, being heavily procedural in its orientation, a particularly helpful or practical way of thinking about how to operationalize consent. We need to see consent as part and parcel of a new relationship, the new relationship we seek to build with Indigenous nations as proper title and rights holders who are reconstituting and rebuilding their political, economic, and social structures. In this context, there is a better way to think about consent, on one that is grounded in the purposes and the goals of Section 35 and the UNDRIP. Consent is analogous to the types of relationships we typically see and are familiar with between governments. In such relations, where governments must work together, there is a range of mechanisms that are used to ensure the authority and autonomy of both governments is respected and decisions are made in a way that is consistent and coherent and does not often lead to regular or substantial disagreements. These mechanisms are diverse and can range from shared bodies and structures to utilizing the same information and standards to agreeing on long-term plans or arrangements that will give clarity to how all decisions will be made on a certain matter or in a certain area over time. Enacting these mechanisms is achieved through a multiplicity of tools, including legislation, policy, and agreements. The structures and mechanisms for achieving this consent, once established, are also consistent over time and across types of decisions. They are known and transparent. Roles and responsibilities are defined, and they are ready to be implemented when needed. One result of this is significant certainty. Of course, this relates to what I was speaking about earlier, about the lack of political will we see to make changes and how governments do not move to implement Section 35 in real ways. Consider for a moment if we spent even a little bit of time over the last 38 years since Section 35 came into being, building on those structures, including, and in my mind, more significantly, undertaking and supporting Indigenous nations rebuilding, rather than denying Indigenous rights and endlessly fighting about their existence. I think we would have been in a totally different place than what we are witnessing now regarding the challenges we see in project development, economic growth, and environmental protection. I see our work of moving towards consent-based decision-making as building these structures and mechanisms of consistent collaborative decision-making with Indigenous nations. Third, this understanding of consent also clarifies that for consent to be fully operationalized as part of a relationship between governments, significant work has to be done by Indigenous nations in addition to the federal and provincial governments. In particular, Indigenous nations need to do the work to reconstitute their nations and governments consistent with the principles in domestic law around proper rights holders and understandings of Indigenous peoples at international law. This is part of Indigenous peoples ensuring that Indigenous jurisdiction and authority, including the giving of consent, is being properly granted and exercised consistent with the right to self-determination, including self-government. One implication of this is that consent will not be operationalized in a linear or uniform manner. It will occur in a diversity of ways, with various steps and stages being taken in different contexts and relationships at different times. The pattern of how we talk about the Declaration, confusion, fear, politically charged, and the lack of realism and pragmatism is not surprisingly being repeated. It's being repeated in the dialogue and the debate around Bill C-15, which is being proposed to implement UNDRIP, as well as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in British Columbia, similar act, which was passed in 2019. These laws, while politically significant, are just a small part of what needs to be done. One of the 5 things I mentioned earlier that need to be done. Alone, they will accomplish little. Upon passage, these bills do not address the Indian Act. They have no mechanisms for independent oversight and enforcement. They do not set up new dispute resolution bodies to address the inevitable issues that will arise. They do not change the Indian reserve system, address systemic racism in policing, health, or any other sector, nor do they establish new models of decision-making that provide for certainty and respect Indigenous rights. What they are is a marker for future work needed that in truth we could have been well down the path of doing with or without legislation. So governments have no mechanisms to implement the minimum standards or to implement the minimum standards, the articles of UNDRIP. Governments have no new supports for nations to self-determine and self-govern. And if any government official, political or administrative person tells you otherwise, it means they do not understand their own legislation, its impacts, or the reality and necessities of what actually is required to deconstruct the ongoing colonial legacy and transform relations. Similarly, those who spread fear about these bills are just spreading misinformation. The UNDRIP laws, as I said, are a small step forward, not more, not less, and nothing to fear. What I fear, though, is with the necessary passage of such laws that public and worse, policymakers might think that the problems are solved, that the hard work has been done, when this, of course, is not the case at all. And why I was pushing for the change that would be needed in the system, and to be quite frank, saw the UNDRIP legislation as a bit of a distraction, albeit a necessary political action, to actually doing the hard work to implement Section 35 and develop a framework to revise all of Canada's laws, policies, and operational practices with process and resources to undertake this work, to build the missing tools. We need tools for concrete action, and these tools need to be in law, not just in policies and practices, because we know what happens. Delay, inaction, doing nothing, talking and fighting in the courts. This is what I fear will become of the future of these laws if they are not quickly supplemented with additional legislation that fills out the mechanisms that are needed. So please view any UNDRIP legislation as only a small, albeit important legislative step, and focus on the work, further legislation that is required. And do not think for one moment it is the panacea. Now, there's another reason why the impact of these laws is limited in the short and medium term. For the needed transformative change to take place, Indigenous peoples have much to do as well. There are questions Indigenous peoples must lead in answering, while other governments get their own houses in order. These are also questions that you're seeing playing out in the headlines every day. The UNDRIP is not going to rebuild our nations for us. The truth is, we are all beginning to see the need for the work of nation rebuilding. What is the government of the nation? Who speaks for the nation? Who are the nation's citizens? How are they chosen? What are the boundaries of a nation's territory? If there is free, prior, and informed consent, who can give it and under what arrangement? And many more. These are the fundamental questions that Indigenous peoples must answer to be self-determining. No one, as I said, can answer them for us. That is what colonization tried to do, and we know the outcome of that. Only the colonized can decolonize. Similarly, the UNDRIP standards do not define the relationship between Indigenous and state laws and jurisdictions, how these distinct orders of government should interact. Yes, consent is one mechanism of that relationship, an important one, but as discussed earlier, we also need to figure out how to operationalize consent on the ground between decision makers, between systems and legal orders. Again, legislative change, new policies, and new practices are needed to achieve this. I could go on, but I think my point is pretty clear. Adopting the UNDRIP standards alone without clear mechanisms, processes, and structures for operationalizing them, and without nations leading the way based on self-determination and doing the hard work of nation and government rebuilding, will not provide the answers to our current challenges. It is to be understood and accepted that the path of making foundational and transformative change will always be controversial in the Indigenous world and in Canada as a whole. I understand that change always brings with it dynamics of fear and resistance as people realize they will have to change, that positions of power or privilege may be lost, that new voices, including women's voices, take a more prominent place as old structures, broken structures, Indian Act structures are dismantled as economies are restructured and governments reshaped. But I firmly believe there is no other way. One does not tinker around the edges of colonialism. One does not reconcile with racism while making little shifts on the side. Colonialism, Indigenous specific racism, these are the dead roots at the heart of the history of this country. And if we let them remain as we have and do not uproot them, the outcome is certainly not a good one. Publicly, this government said it was going to finally adopt these solutions. What happened? The real story was a failure of leadership at the very top and a failure of will, a failure to care enough to actually act in real, meaningful, and tangible ways to help transform lives, to create space to rebuild Indigenous nations, and therefore a more prosperous Canada. Rather, they promise bold change while largely doing the same old thing. I hope this gives you a glimpse of where we are at and what we need to do. I hope it also puts the UNDRIP in some perspective and how it fits into the broader work of decolonization. Let me be clear. I am positive. I remain positive. There has been progress. Nations are doing the hard work in new ways with innovation. Canadians are adding more of their voices to this important work every day, with a greater understanding amongst more people about what must be done. The 10 principles remain on the books. The UNDRIP legislation, while not perfect, is a starting point and a step forward. For the long overdue and urgent change that is needed, we need people to stick their necks out, but not just leaders, all of us, everyone, everywhere. We all have a role to play. Once again, it rests upon all of us to hold governments to account. And in my view today, there is still time to do the right thing, so let's do it. And in closing, I'm going to give the last word to the Prime Minister. He said these words, again, He said these words on February the 14th, 2018, words I know very well. Quote, with a recognition and implementation of rights framework, we can build that new relationship together. It won't be easy, Mr. Speaker. Nothing worth doing ever is, but it will be worth it. It will be worth it because we'll have been taken more steps towards righting historic wrongs. It'll be worth it because we will have replaced apathy with action, ignorance with understanding, and conflict with respect. We'll have laid the foundation for real and lasting change, the kind of change that can only come when we fully recognize and implement Indigenous rights. Together, we will take the concrete action to build a better future, a better Canada for Indigenous peoples and all Canadians, end quote. Gala Kasla, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was a tremendous talk, and I have copious pages of notes here. I'm learning a lot, and I really appreciate you taking time to lay this out. I think that there's so many things to take away from this talk. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of the discussion and into some of the questions and answers. I'll just say a couple things before we jump in. First of all, the transcript that you see running at the bottom of your screen, if you've clicked it, there are a number of spelling mistakes and incorrect words there. Please be aware that we will be correcting that for the posted copy of this video that will be put up onto the website. So if you come back and watch this video again, those closed caption comments will be updated and corrected as well as we can. For anybody who isn't aware, we do have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on that and post questions in. I've noticed that there are a few questions that are coming through in the chat as well, and I'll monitor that as well as I can. So I think we'll jump in and start looking at some of these questions. And I'm going to start with Brian's comment. This came in early in the talk. He says, so the long list of poor performance with regards to Indigenous peoples is well known. It's not unique to the treatment of our Indigenous compatriots. I think that he's referring to other poor performances that we've seen. Observably, governments of different stripes appear unable to execute even the most basic programs, regardless of the program. Lots of talk and yet lacking in action. What are your thoughts on how this inability to act needs to be addressed? In the private sector, it goes by the title of culture change, which means reducing the number of steps and the levels of approvals. But what are your thoughts? Or do you have thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, and thanks, Brian, for the question. It's a continuation of some of the thoughts that I just spoke about in my address. But you know, the reality, and I was speaking specifically about the current government, but as you say, the reality is that inaction in terms of addressing true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in this country has been something that has been very same or similar with all governments since 1867, as we know, in terms of when the so-called Fathers of Confederation came together, Indigenous peoples were left out. And what we've been trying to do in the intervening years is to correct that mistake. We've made some great strides, including in 1982, as I talked about with Section 35, but every government, as I said, has taken the approach of denying rights of Indigenous peoples. Why? Well, I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. We can look at political reasons for that, the reality of Indigenous peoples and their impact on electoral success, for example. There are many excuses that are used by governments that it's, and this isn't just federal, it's provincial governments, it's too hard, it's too complicated, it takes too long. Well, of course it's going to take a long time, but we actually need to have the political will to change the trajectory, or as I like to call it, change the direction of a freighter that's been going on the same tact in the ocean for so long. It does take time, but it does changing the foundations of how we approach Indigenous issues as governments and as Indigenous peoples. We have to stop denying rights, recognize rights, and form a new relationship based on respect for those rights. And how we go about doing that is enabling Indigenous communities to rebuild within what I know to be a robust constitutional framework. And we've seen it across the country, how we're going to shake governments out of their complacency or intransigence. Well, I think it's happening. I really do, in spite of my being the Minister of Justice and being unable to do it. Canadians are speaking up. Indigenous peoples are galvanizing. There's more Indigenous communities that are becoming self-governing and showing tremendous success. And so there's a lot of building on that success. And again, it's back to building allyships and demanding that this is the right thing to do. If COVID-19 has highlighted anything, it's the marginalization that exists within our society. And as I was taught from a very young age, everybody in a community and a society has a role to play. And when you're prevented from playing that role, as Indigenous peoples have been, as other marginalized Canadians have been, the society suffers, and we need to correct that. So it's going to take all of us, as I said, to jolt governments out of their complacency and demand change.
Thank you for that. There's two clumps of questions that are emerging, one from an Indigenous perspective and one from a settler perspective. So I want to start from the Indigenous perspective, and I'll use Jennifer's question as the example. So Jennifer writes, I'm First Nations and I'm concerned about the Indian Act and how it will affect future generations, especially my daughters. What legal approach could we take to address or challenge the Indian Act that still operates to oversee our lives? We're the only Canadians that need to show that we are First Nations. I think that's correct. And I wonder if we can change the Indian Act or get rid of it altogether. There are a number of other people who have asked similar things in our comments, and I wonder if you can address that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, and everybody else that has raised questions about how we change or get rid of the Indian Act. I mean, I guess at a very quick answer, we don't want to change the Indian Act. We want to get rid of the Indian Act. And in its place, we want strong, self-determining, including self-governing First Nations in this country who have rebuilt. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about the Indian Act's going to be gone in 5 years if we do this, that, or the other thing. The challenge has been, and this has been a challenge since long before for me, but particularly when I was the regional chief, we used to have these conversations among our chiefs in British Columbia. We can get rid of the Indian Act tomorrow. There could be a government that had the will to do that, but we need to know what replaces it. So if we were to get rid of the Indian Act tomorrow, what would happen in our communities? We need to be able to deconstruct that colonial reality, and at our own pace and based on our own priorities as Indigenous nations, as communities, we need to be able to replace the Indian Act and its impoverished notion of government with our own nations, with rebuilding our own institutions of government. For example, how do we define who our citizens are, our legal status and capacity? How do we elect our governing bodies, and how do they make decisions? We need to rebuild our constitutions. When Indigenous communities have done that, and this is what I spoke about in my speech, we need a mechanism in law in this country in order for Indigenous communities to move out from under the Indian Act. Short of negotiating in interminable negotiations for decades and beyond, or going to court and having or seeking to have the Indian Act provisions rendered ultra vires or beyond scope, we need to have a mechanism to enable Indigenous communities, when they choose and when they have rebuilt their institutions of government, to be able to move out from under the Indian Act, the colonial structure. There will be jurisdictions that First Nations, Indigenous peoples, will want to exercise or draw down, and that's entirely within their right. Some of those jurisdictions will require intergovernmental relationships between other Indigenous governments and between provincial and federal governments. I've always said, and I said this at a lecture at Queen's many years ago, this is the beauty of our the evolving nature of our cooperative federalism. There is a place for Indigenous governments within it.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And now I'll come to the other side of the question. This is coming from settler Canadians, and they're asking, what can they do? And I'll read Elizabeth's comment because it speaks to it. What would you like settler Canadians to say or to do specifically or practically with their MPs and federal candidates in relation to UNDRIP, especially in light of the coming federal election?
It's a great question. And Elizabeth, you know when the federal election is, like, tell us all. I know that is coming at some point, but I think it's a really important question. And it certainly is one that is raised among so many people I talk to when I used to, before COVID, knock on doors in Vancouver and Granville, people asking what they can do to assist, to elevate these issues, to press governments to change their behaviors. I think I just answered your question when I just said that, but specifically to your point, recognize the UNDRIP legislation is likely going to be going to the Senate and will likely be passed before Parliament rises for the summer. Challenge the candidates that are running in your riding to go beyond simply thinking, and it doesn't matter who they are, Indigenous issues and rights recognition has to be nonpartisan. Challenge people that want to be your elected officials to say what it is that they believe needs to be done. And if they don't have an answer, that's okay. Have a conversation about what practical tools, many of which I described in my speech, are necessary to advance true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Wherever you are and wherever you live, build relationships with the Indigenous peoples of those lands. Have conversations, understand where they're at in terms of their decolonization, and support them. I think the greatest thing, and I know that there's people on here from Vancouver, Granville that I knock on doors with, and I know have book clubs and talk about these issues. Raise your level of understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples and their relationship with governments. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, MMIWG, there's a lot of RCAP, still a Bible in my mind, and that was over 35 years ago. Review all of these documents and the solutions that have been around forever. But most importantly, Elizabeth and everybody else, settlers, as you call yourself, allies, as I know that you are, is elevate these issues. The only way these issues are going to be elevated in election campaigns is if Canadians demand that they are, much like all of the systemic racism and horrible realities that have reared their head during COVID-19. We have to deal with these social justice issues in order to, as this current government talks about, build back better. We can't leave any of these people behind, and it's high time that we actually address these issues in a transformative way.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to, there's a couple of kind of linked questions here. The first one, and I don't know who posed this, it's anonymous. Don't you think it might be dangerous to pass the current UNDRIP Bill C-15 without the frameworks and mechanisms you've described? Isn't there a danger that lack of progress will lead to bitterness and disillusionment? I'm not so sure myself, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think it's important in question, anonymous person. I think these are the discussions that we have to have, and the concerns about passing, what potential impacts it might have, myths that are out there in terms of what this bill does and doesn't do, need to be discussed. I have no fear with the passage of this bill that will impact negatively the reality of Indigenous peoples or their rights. What it does do, as I said, is one step forward. I will say that when I was Minister of Justice, I said something publicly that got a lot of attention, that adopting UNDRIP into Canadian law without changing other laws is unworkable. And what I meant by that was the fear or the reality that I understood that we can't have UNDRIP on the books, which speaks to in Articles 3 and 4 self-determination and self-government. At the same time, we have a racist colonial statute still on the books. So yeah, anonymous, this is a concern. This is a concern of many people, and rightfully, there's now an amendment to have an action plan in this legislation within 2 years to put in place the action plan and the framework. Well, why should we trust government when they haven't done anything to this point? We need to continue to press government to ensure that this framework, that the laws, policies, and practices of government are changed, that we're not moving forward and addressing Indigenous issues in an uncoordinated, incoherent way. That's why we need a framework. That's what we should keep pressing government to do. But I hear you, and I have the exact same concern that this government and the next government, whatever that government is, will simply say, we passed the UNDRIP Act and there's nothing more to do. Well, I'm sorry, anybody that does that is being completely disingenuous in terms of their intentions, and are doing it and saying it for political expediency and no other reason. And we need to challenge them.
Thank you for that. Anna is asking, how would the relationship between the federal and the provincial governments influence this process? You know, how might the fact that not all of these governments are getting along influence what's trying to happen, or what we're trying to make happen in Ottawa?
Yeah, it's a very enduring question, and it doesn't, as you public policy people know, it doesn't and isn't specifically isolated to Indigenous issues in terms of the challenge of the relationship between different orders of government. There will be, and there always has been, governments that have been favorable, provincial governments that have been favorable to advancing Indigenous issues, and those that have not. The challenge in federal, provincial, and territorial relationships is going to always exist in terms of the delineation between Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution. Added to that, Section 35 needs to be there, and we need to figure out the relationships between and among those jurisdictions of power. I guess I would just say, in terms of an example, and I mentioned it briefly in my remarks, the provincial government here in British Columbia has taken steps. They have already led the way in terms of adopting an UNDRIP bill to make the laws of the province consistent with the UNDRIP. And there has been movement among Indigenous leaders and provincial elected officials to move that action plan forward. And there's been some progress. And again, in British Columbia, and I'm more familiar obviously with this area than any other area of the country, there's been a tremendous amount of advocacy and support. Vancouver is a city of reconciliation, also adopting through council the need to bring UNDRIP principles into their ways of operating at the city. The pressure has been mounting, and the importance of settling these questions and recognizing rights, whether it be when we consider the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion or otherwise, have been pressing the government here to do something. So there are good practices, and trying to make the case, although I don't think we need to make the case anymore. It's evidence that our economy, resource development, and other economic drivers are impaired by not actually settling the outstanding land question, honoring treaties, and ensuring Indigenous peoples have appropriate systems of government to run their communities.
And I think this leads into another question that Sarah has posed. Sarah writes about the inherent rights policy and or the inherent rights policy to self-government. And she asks, is this something that continues to help or hinder the promise of Section 35? And she goes on to say, I know you use the phrase drawing down powers. Do you find that a contingent rights approach to self-government is enough?
Well, it's definitely a good question, and the inherent right of self-government policy has been on the books for a long time. It's one of those policies that need to be looked at and need to be changed. Included among the policies would be the specific claims policy and how you reconcile that with rights recognition. Also, what's called the comprehensive claims policy, which is a series of policies that haven't fundamentally changed in decades. These are the policies that need to change, that need to be changed in terms of that broader framework of rights recognition. I mean, the inherent rights self-government policy that's still on the books is not necessarily a bad policy, but it needs to be adapted with the input of Indigenous communities, expressing how it is and creating the steps of how they want to move towards self-government, move out of the Indian Act. There have been various iterations of legislation, private member, public members' bills that have been introduced in the Senate to create that mechanism to articulate jurisdictions, core jurisdictions, and other jurisdictions that could be or would be shared. In the last one was one that I worked with when I was regional chief with Senator St. Germain, Bill 212, self-government legislation. These bills, although they need work and direct input time and energy, would create the mechanism that we need in order to move out from under the Indian Act. And it's determined in terms of what the individual First Nation community, Indigenous community will determine how they want their government run. There are key powers that certainly do not need to be negotiated or have conversations around in terms of running a government, but there will be other powers that will need to be discussed, not as, with one party having dominion over the other, but having an intergovernmental relationship about how these jurisdictions are going to be exercised. Very similar conversation in terms of, the division of powers that we have many Supreme Court of Canada cases over the years in terms of how they're exercised and the double aspects of them.
It's an incredibly complicated issue for sure. So thanks for shedding a little bit of light on that. Margaret's asked a question that I'd like to pose, because this is the question I always tell my students to ask. And that is, are there any countries that have dealt with Indigenous peoples, that's the way that it's written here, in a better way? I guess where there's better legislative frameworks, where there are better governance frameworks in place that we could learn from.
Gosh, well, I think that, it's a good question. I think that there are aspects of the relationship between states and Indigenous peoples that we can look to around the world that are positive. Mm-hmm. And there are nation states that we can look to that treat the Indigenous populations abhorrently. And I think in that context, in the context of Canada, we have Section 35, and I think we need to realize that Indigenous peoples around the world look to Canada somewhat as a model in terms of how having Section 35 in our Constitution. Having said that, there's a lot we can learn by just looking south of the border in terms of the self-governing Indian nations in the United States. there's a lot of work that's been done there. There was a lot of creation of this space many, many decades ago for Indigenous peoples. I mean, I remember when I was the Minister of Justice, I went down and met the Justice Minister and Attorney General of the Navajo Nation, which is fantastic. So there's places that we can look. You know, the challenge is still with the relationship between Indigenous nations and their federal government or regional governments. We can look to New Zealand and their relationship with the Indigenous people there. There have been some really positive movements made in terms of territory, Indigenous people giving rights to the natural world and water. So there's lots of examples. And I think ultimately coming together as Indigenous nations did with respect to UNDRIP and trying to articulate in its 46 articles the experiences across the globe of Indigenous peoples is something that we've benefited from. But I actually agree with the question and the question you ask your students or ask your students to ask rather. It's an important question to know where there have been successes, where there's models, and we not have to look too far within our domestic reality to see the 25 Indigenous nations in this country that are self-governing, that have become self-governing in various ways, whether that be through comprehensive treaty negotiations or standalone self-government agreements, have different ways that they exercise their authority and have built their core institutions. And the vast majority of them have eclipsed the economies in their neighboring municipalities and communities because of the fact there's an understanding about how they govern and make decisions.
And you've anticipated what a few of our viewers have written in. People have pointed out the Niska Nation and what they've been able to do. And there are other terrific examples in BC, of course, where really we've seen wonderful development of self-governance and self-determination. So thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to flag a great comment from Joel. So Joel writes, I'm First Nations, and I would like Jody's comments on how she thinks Indigenous people can come together to raise a more united and effective voice in working with federal and provincial governments to determine whatever replaces the Indian Act. So Joel is with you and the Indian Act is going out, but how do we replace it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Joel, for that question. And this is a question, as we talked about earlier, has been around for a long time. It's an important one, and we need to continue bringing it up and asking it. I remember when I was regional chief, and the national chief at the time was Sean Adlio, and he made this statement that we were going to get rid of the Indian Act in 5 years. Obviously, that didn't happen. But again, back to what I said before, I envision a world and a reality where we have within a coherent and comprehensive framework federally that enables Indigenous communities at their own pace and based on their own priorities to move out of the Indian Act as they go through a process of basic community development work, which we see around the world, but has to happen and is happening right here in our communities. To answer your question about how we see or how can Indigenous communities come together, I mean, I can only base it on my experience, having been a council person in my home community and being fortunate enough to have been elected regional chief. We went through, and I was regional chief for just over 6 years. And in British Columbia, we have 203 Indian Act chiefs. We went through a process of examining where we're at the time and challenging each other. Certainly, I challenged the chiefs and they challenged me about how we want to move forward. I ran on a platform of building on our success. Central to that was rebuilding Indigenous nations and strong government. We developed together a governance toolkit that spoke about all the experiences and the realities and successes between and among Indigenous communities in British Columbia. And we would get into rooms together, and this is my advice, I guess. We would get into rooms together as leaders in the province, and we would, I don't want to say fight it out because I didn't really fight, but we would have vigorous discussions about issues and about how we achieve our ultimate objective, which I think is the same for most Indigenous people and leaders in this country, which is to be self-determining, including self-governing, and ultimately contribute to the improved quality of life for our people. How do we get there? There's lots of different ways. But what we did in British Columbia was get into that room, hammer it out, write papers, put forward recommendations. And when we came out of that room, we would have gone through a process of consensus-based decision-making. And I, quite fortunately, was given a mandate from my chiefs to go forward to the federal or provincial governments with that clear mandate about what it is we wanted to do. The same process is happening in communities regionally and should happen nationally among Indigenous peoples. There are lots of different forums that are taking place. The self-governing nations have a fiscal table that they're sitting at and supporting one another in terms of advancing the challenges that they still face, and they sit with the federal government and have these important conversations. So it's a matter of not pitting each other against ourselves, but recognizing we have a common goal and figuring out the path in which we can get there as much as we can together.
Thank you for that.
That's you. That's Joel. That's you and my job to do. Like together, we have to figure it out.
I think it's a very big job, but I'm glad people here are identifying and coming up with some really great ideas. And I'll just interject and say there's some terrific comments and ideas and thoughts being shared through the chat. And we're keeping track of all of this. I don't think we're going to get to everything in the 15 minutes or so that we have left, but we're going to try to do as much as we can. We have a great question from Mindo, who asks, do you think that the changes made to Canada's impact assessment agency, so around environmental impact assessment, and BC's environmental impact assessment acts, do you think that these are a continuation of consultation, or that they can be useful vehicles to advance consent-based decision-making?
Well, I mean, it's a really important question, and I would say that there have been some minor changes that have been expressed in federal legislation in terms of Indigenous peoples and engaging with Indigenous peoples in terms of how development takes place, and a recognition that that discussion needs to continue to unfold. I would say, in answer to the question, more needs to be done. And the challenge that we have around resource development projects and assessing their environmental sustainability and their impacts will be better served when we have Indigenous nations that are self-governing, that have answered the questions that I talked about in my speech about how they govern themselves, how they're going to make decisions about their territory. And when there are proper processes in legislation in place and in policy that enable new ways of making those decisions, not simply an extension of the consultation and accommodation policies that exist. Consultation and accommodation, the reality of those policies means that one party, one government has dominion over the other. That's not what I'm talking about or what we're talking about when we speak of FPIC or consent. It's a recognition that Indigenous peoples have title and rights to territories, and figuring out how the relationship with the proper title holders of the land will unfold in a new, respectful way that's based on, a form of consensus-based decision-making and new patterns of relationships is how we're going to address that consent issue, which would lead to less conflict and contention, as I talked about, less concern over resource development projects, because from the very beginning, there would have been an appropriate relationship and a more certain pathway to follow in terms of addressing the issues with the real decision makers.
There's been a couple of really important questions raised about the shapes of these self-governing territories or self-governing nations. There's been one point made about on reserve versus off reserve. Now, that's geographic and maybe not the actual nation, because the nations are the people, not the place, or it is the people in place. Something that I think we need to address. The other point is around Inuit and Métis people that are not, included in Section 35, but not necessarily in the Indian Act. And so, does this complicate the tools that we need? How do we bring that part into the discussion?
Yeah, important questions. And Warren, I'm looking up at the corner of my screen and haven't been able to look at the questions that have been posed, but there's lots. And I would love to be able to know what the questions and the comments are to continue this discussion. But I recognize that people are responding. I think that's fantastic. In terms of territory, the on reserve, off reserve distinction, I'm not sure the general nature of the comments around it. But Indigenous communities in British Columbia, across the country, have ancestral lands and territories upon which they have survived for millennia. Reserves, or the distinction between on and off reserve, is something that was imposed and put in place by virtue of the Indian Act. Yes, there are realities in terms of the on reserve and off reserve populations that need to be addressed. And there have been various measures put in place by the courts to ensure that off-reserve communities have a say in what happens on reserve in terms of elections, et cetera. But moving forward with nation and government rebuilding, we need to get away from that distinction. And certainly, perhaps in most communities, reserve lands are core lands to the Indigenous community and will form our lands that will be for them places where they continue to live and build and expand their communities. But I think the distinction between on and off reserve is something that we need to move away from and recognize that the ancestral lands, the title and rights lands of Indigenous peoples in this country extend far beyond those boundaries, and the need for Indigenous peoples to have a land base in which their community can grow and thrive. And beyond that, in terms of rights territory, to ensure that we have mechanisms and processes in place that ensure Indigenous peoples have a say in what happens on the land, that there be models of shared decision-making, of cooperative management between Indigenous nations and other governments. And this goes to the environmental assessment question. People who have survived off and lived off the land that they've been on for thousands of years have a very different approach to sustainability and how we maintain the environment and the natural world. And that needs to be incorporated into the laws that we have, and Indigenous knowledge of our territories needs to be definitely listened to, but incorporated into how we combat climate change and how we ensure our environment is sustainable 7 generations out. Oh, and then in terms of the question around Métis and Inuit, just a short answer. I mean, I think that, well, I don't think, Inuit and Métis, obviously in the Constitution, have rights. They need to be respected. There are very different realities in terms of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, all of which are important, all of which need to be addressed. The federal government has developed what they call distinction-based approaches to Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people. But the demands, the realities the having been left out realities when it comes to the Métis people, the Métis Nation, need to be addressed both by the federal government and the respective provincial and territorial governments.
There have been a number of people asking about not only what they can do, but what they can read and what they can see. Sharon writes, you mentioned a book talk. Can you recommend a book or further reading to learn more about Indigenous rights and the action of UNDRIP?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, there's lots of books from Indigenous scholars. I mean, the one that I always mention that comes to mind is by Bob Joseph, 21 Things That We Need to Know About the Indian Act. It's a good short read. Not to recommend like putting or taking off those huge volumes of RCAP or TRC or the Murdered and Missing Women's report, but those are important documents to read or to scan through in terms of personal perspectives about the impact of various like residential schools or the reality of violence against women. I would read those. This is totally shameless, but you can read my book. And that's not the only book that's out there. There's lots of significant Indigenous people that have written books, but just grab some of them. And I would just say, broadly speaking, I said this recently, the books that I find the most interesting are the ones where an Indigenous person or somebody reflects on their own personal experiences with respect to the ongoing colonial legacy and presents solutions about how to overcome those. There's lots of those books out there. So I'd recommend get involved in a book club, etc. There's lots of them.
Okay. And Joyce points out that the Canadian Political Science Association also has lots of links and things that might support people's desire to learn more about this topic. We're getting very close to the end of our time, and there are many, many questions here that we haven't been able to get at or to address. I see even more things are popping up as I'm speaking, so it's going to be hard to answer everything. What I can promise is a couple things. First of all, this lecture, this talk, and this discussion will be archived onto our website, on the School of Policy Studies website. So you'll be able to go back and revisit it, and the closed captioning will be fixed so that all of the words that have been misquoted or misspelled, hopefully we will have fixed. We will make sure that we keep track of all your questions. So the questions that are being posed here and the comments that you're being made, we'll capture those and we'll pass them along to our honorable guest so that you can review and see what's been there. There have been a couple of requests for contact, and so we'll make sure that that gets passed along to you so that you can see what people are thinking. There are some wonderful, wonderful comments, and I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's been participating and throwing your ideas and your thoughts out. I want to read something that Christian wrote here. Speaking as an Indigenous person, I feel that we, the people of our nation, exist as part of all the land, regardless of the boundaries established by settler doctrine. I see our nation as the people of the nation, not just a space that's been carved out for us on a map. I think it's a beautiful thought. And I like the way that you phrased it and the way that you've put it down there. I wanted to call attention to it as we sort of come to the end of this talk. I'd like to ask if you have anything that you would like to say that you didn't get a chance to say during all of our discussion before we come to a close. Is there anything, last words you'd like to share?
Well, first of all, I would simply like to say thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. But beyond that, thank you for having this discussion. And I'm sure that you will continue to have ongoing discussions about true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I agree with you in what you said at the beginning, that this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, outstanding public policy issue that must be addressed in this country, aside from climate change, certainly. But to everybody that tuned in, and I do look forward to getting a list of the questions that people have asked. I know that there's a diversity of opinions about how we address Indigenous rights and how we move forward. All opinions are important, and I hope to be able to continue to be a part of Queen's U and the public policy studies as we continue to tackle this really important, outstanding public policy issue together. So Gaelic hustle to everybody that that tuned in today.
Well, thank you so
Warren.
much. Thank you. And, you know, on behalf of Queen's University and all of the participants today, thank you for taking time, for being with us, for sharing your thoughts. There are a lot of really difficult questions, but you've handled them so well and you've shared such knowledge. I think we're all walking away from this understanding a little bit more and maybe thinking a little bit more about this. And that's really what we wanted to achieve. So with that, I'd like to draw this session to a close. I hope that all of you stay safe and healthy as we go into the summer. I hope that you do get a chance to enjoy the beautiful weather that is finally with us after a cold and not wonderful winter. And I'm looking forward to the time when we can all come together and see each other face to face, because although these tools are useful, it's a difficult forum, because right now we should be doing a round of applause and a standing ovation for the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould. So thank you so much for taking time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gaelic hustle, everybody.
Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.